About approximately. Good enough. So then actually, I'm going to use this timekeeping app. We'll make this noise. Is that pretty cool? Now, without further ado, let's open this link and give the floor to Brian.
Gigi, we good? It's a terrible thing when every 4 years a new leader can come along and promise you the world, but at the end of that term, deliver nothing but a hellish economy. We want to change that. What's the mechanism of opening government? I mean, this is going to take ages to set up and lay out entirely. The broad theme is we would do it as well as we can and in as many places as we can. The parallel here is to how we set up the ICC court system, to try and give countries an incentive to opt into the court, even if in the long run some individual leaders who could potentially have pulled them out might be subject to the court's jurisdiction anyway. We'll give you some reasons in just a bit as to why, broadly speaking, countries, the vast majority of democratic countries around the world, will be willing to do this. Second of all, we would try as far as we can to build these into economic organizations that already exist, like the WTO, but also local regional ones as well, that countries have good reason to participate in as an added reason for them to stay in, or at the very least political cover to do so. Third of all, in terms of enforcement, we'd use like a plethora of things here, potentially international sanctions against the wealth of particular individuals who are held responsible. We think this is also a particularly good way of getting countries on board if to an extent some restorative justice is delivered to those people, so they have a democratic reason to try and hold this person to account if he is in their country, to give him up. We would also broadly prosecute lenders, for example, people who aided and abetted, or at the very least we can stop these things from happening at the point where a guilty verdict is delivered. So admittedly it's going to be a toolkit and a toolbox, a range of things here. They will always make things harder for these individuals going forward, and as a result, the debate will still function. What is the definition this court will use of a disastrous economic policy? The first thing I would say here is it's going to be representative, so no claims of racism here, please, even if we did start with the ICC. It's going to be representative as well of economic ideologies. So this is going to mean that only the worst types of policies that had no defenses whatsoever, in the sense that even if it did make a group better, it could have been made better in a significantly more powerful, more substantial way, or that gross negligence was involved, that an economy or economies connected to that one entirely tanked. That's the sort of thing we're talking about here, not defensible cases of protectionism where on the margins a couple of groups were affected. We're looking at things like the mass deregulation, those of you who were there watching that Euros debate, of the financial sector, which caused a global meltdown, or things like in more local settings, Mugabe's land snatchers or Idi Amin kicking out all commercial interests and as a result causing the economy of his people to tank. Broadly, in terms of the jurisdiction of this court, it is going to be more outcome focused as opposed to intention focused. We do not want leaders to try and say things like, oh, I had no way of knowing. I mean, sure, that might be a potential defense, but it's not going to get them all the way to full acquittal. It's going to be outcome based in the same way like, if you hit someone with a car, you might not be murder, but the manslaughter charge is pretty much outcome based, and we want action to be taken for those things for the reasons of deterrence we'll get to in just a second. Last of all, the penalty is as far as we can restorative, to try and take from their personal wealth things which go to people, but even if it's just denying this leader future access to like the halls of banking or whatever it is that he or she, I guess potentially, was promised during the political economy cycle that led them to make these decisions in the first place, we think it's still hugely impactful that people can feel justice being done, which is why the people of America were very big to try and push Congress to hold the leaders of Wall Street accountable. It's very much the same net effect there that we are striving for. First of all, why will countries sign on? Yeah, go ahead.
What happens in the cases where parliamentarians are the one who vote the policy? How about the leader?
To the extent, okay, it's ambiguous. If there was a small group of individuals clearly responsible for setting economic policy, like in the US, then this code would apply. In those cases, we were happy to run the most sensible version of the debate, or at the very least, it's no different from the status quo. We're not quite sure why that's a harm. So, why would they sign on? Number one, trade benefits that come from these existing organizations that they can, it's hard to disentangle themselves from status quo organizations, and as a result, we think most of them, with some prop fiat, will stay in. Second of all, given that they get some restorations to their country and their people, it is a good reason to stay in these courts, because if they get fucked over personally by an economically disastrous policy, they can use this mechanism to hold others to account in the same way that the ICC does prosecute on behalf of countries when they don't have the resources or don't have the space to do so for themselves. Of course, we'll allow them to do so by themselves if that is what they so desire. Last of all, because in many cases, people want to hold someone accountable. Again, see what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis with Wall Street. In an election, every politician who proposes pulling out is going to look as though they have no confidence in their economic policy. And I think in the long run, this means there's a race at the bottom that is good for us insofar as most leaders will commit to staying in things like the WTO, even if the enforcement mechanism of a disastrous economic policy is something like what we stand for today. What are the effects of this? In the short run, democratic leaders, in terms of political economy, must be more accountable to people. The problem right now is for things like political political leverage and donations or just support from power players in the economy, lots of political leaders, in order to get elected in the short run, no thank you, do things like pander heavily to their interests, even if it is economic policy that is going to be terrible for the vast majority of people. They can get away with this in the short run because there are things like term limits, which means that even if the economy goes to shit by year 6, they're on their way out, they're a lame duck, but crucially, they've got a good set of allies for the next phase of their political, or just, in general, their career. Additionally, the marginal voter is quite small, which means that in terms of persuading people, these power players are uniquely special instead of caring about the broad base of the economy as a whole. No, what changes? First of all, we think we stop short-termism, because the point is, even if you survive the 6 to 8 years of your political term, you can be held accountable if what you did was genuinely disastrous for a large number of people. It leads you to make better policies in the long run. No. Second of all, there is a larger group of the economy that you care about for broadly the same reason. Third of all, even if you had to make a trade-off in economic policies, you're more likely to distribute those benefits to a larger group of people because that is less likely to pass the threshold of being a disaster. It is a disaster if only a particular group of landowners, for example, reap the benefits of a particularly lopsided economic policy. If that gets taxed heavily and given out in the form of welfare, that's a stronger outcome-based defense that leaders are now in fear of prosecution, more likely to do in advance. That's good for the vast majority of people. How does this affect macroeconomies in the long run, on a larger scale? I think in the long run, this leads to less risk in economic decision making. Why? Because the more likely you are, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, to be able to say, I did this at the advice and sort of consulting of a large number of economists. This was the least drastic action. It's not pulling on the levers in huge directions. It's trying to keep the boat steady. That is the kind of thing which leads to fairly neutral outcomes. So we are willing essentially to trade slightly less rapid growth in some cases if there is a lot less rapid degrowth or destruction of wealth that happens as a result of gigantically bad policies. Why are we okay with this trade-off? Two broad things here. Number one, because it is good. These fluctuations wipe out wealth through things like savings for the lower and middle class, which for many people is the way they climb the wealth ladder. The largest generator of inequality in the last 10 years was not the fact that Wall Street individuals earn way more money than the poor people. It's the fact that those people whose savings were invested in their houses or in their banks were wiped out by the financial crisis. And that's a sort of giant fluctuation that doesn't happen as often on our side of the house on the comparative. Second of all, there is greater continuity versus constant reversals of economic policy as long as the Republicans and Democrats come in and try and insert their ideology onto the type of policy that is there. It means businesses can make better economic decisions, both in terms of other countries that they're entering, but also the country that they are in. That, I think, in the long run, means that electoral cycles don't affect the economy quite so much, and people's livelihoods aren't at stake in terms of the outcome of, who happens to win Florida, who happens to win Maine, who happens to win a particular state. This means that when it comes to people's bread and butter issues, in terms of the things they care about, putting food on the table, their welfare, on this very basic need, it is less likely to be taken away from them. For all of these reasons, propose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Hello? Okay, perfect. Great. I guess I'll have to hold it. Thank you, panel. The fact that text uses the example of mass deregulation of Wall Street is a good reason as to why we shouldn't pursue this policy, because there are very sensible reasons as to why we would want deregulation. A lower reserve ratio increases the leverage that you have, which means that you can increase the money multiplier by giving out more money to other people and allowing mom and pop businesses to grow, stimulating the economy. The fundamental point that I'm making here is that the vast majority of economic decisions which would be classified under this policy probably have some degree to which it can be considered meritorious. As such, we don't think it's the position for a court to decide this, but rather for individuals to be able to take those risks when it's necessary to reform an economy and make it better. Two things I'm going to broadly do for you. First of all, I'm going to engage with what we got with text very briefly, then I'm going to move into 4 constructive arguments. First of all, talk about why this is an imprecise measure of responsibility. Second of all, talk about the legitimacy of international institutions. Third of all, talk about economic restructuring and the ability to use funds. And fourth, about why this harms the disprivileged. To begin with, in terms of text's material, I just want to briefly engage with this. First of all, he exemplifies this as cases of gross negligence. I just think it's very difficult to actually draw this line, that in many circumstances, these lines are very thin. For instance, Thatcher's reorganization of the economy, which harmed a lot of miners, could potentially be viewed in this same way because it substantially affected the working class while benefiting those who are predominantly at the top, even though it would have trickle-down effects later on. The second thing that I want to broadly attack is their idea about whether or not these people are going to actually sign up. I just think it's unclear whether or not this is true. There are lots of benefits towards gaining international favor by being in the International Criminal Court, but it's unclear whether or not that is worth it to the vast majority of citizens who oftentimes view these institutions as incredibly biased. Note the ICC prosecutes people who commit war crimes against their people, and they can't even get the international buy-in that is necessary. I'm not sure if economically disastrous policies are that significantly different. On more rapid growth, I think this assumes that we're living in countries which are already good, but in the developing world, sometimes I think you need to take radical steps in order to improve your standard of living within your country, because the relative harms that come from this policy, no thank you, aren't likely to affect the average person who's already disprivileged and incredibly poor, but are likely to have massive upsides. See, for instance, economic growth in places like China. Constructive. First, about the imprecise measure of responsibility. I just want to point out that text never really answered the POI. You can't just say, we'll do the most sensible thing in response to the parliamentarians' POI, because that infers that that just presumes that you already know what the most sensible thing is and you just implement it. That's just not how debate works. You have to explain it a little bit more. No thanks. So I think in this circumstance, what's likely to happen is twofold. Either you hold these individuals accountable, which I think is massively unfair, or second of all, you have a situation where leaders are never held accountable because the parliamentarians voted for it, which means that every single economic vote will just always go through a parliament first, meaning that their policy does absolutely nothing. Let's engage with the first case, which I think is more charitable to them. No thanks. I think that there are two fundamental problems that come from this. And these are drawn by these problems. The problem is that many of these policies are pushed by factions with immense power within these governments. So it's not always the case that the leader gets the most power. For instance, you still have to follow the ANC if you're within South Africa and have to follow some basic fundamental policies and lobbying towards certain groups who you gain your benefits from. As such, this means that parliamentarians who make this vote are going to A, make it so that there's no changing incentives from individuals, no thank you, because they're no longer able to be held accountable in this circumstance. Or I think you get a significant problem of significant unfairness. These people get put away for the actions of parliamentarians in many different circumstances, and that means that you instrumentalize them, no thank you, which is remarkably unfair. I think in terms of weighing this principled argument in the round, you need to consider that we don't just prosecute people and harm them on a utilitarian basis. It may be good for me to take a random passerby and prosecute them for murder to deter everyone else in society, but that doesn't mean it's fair, because someone's fundamental rights cannot be instrumentalized by the state as a tool of the state on the basis of individual dignity. No, thank you. Second, on the legitimacy of international institutions. As we both acknowledge in this debate, you need to be able to join these international institutions for them to have any power. I'm going to give you a few reasons as to why it's still unlikely that you will join these institutions despite what text says. First of all, note that there's a massive political problem with prosecution. So that means that when you're choosing which country to prosecute, you have to take into account whether or not you'll hurt your allies. That looks like in the International Criminal Court, primarily prosecuting, no thank you, African leaders rather than leaders from other parts of the world who committed horrific war crimes. The consequence then is that the average citizen is going to look at this court as biased, as one that doesn't actually represent people. And therefore, his argument about citizens having the incentive to protect themselves is untrue. They'll just think that the court is needlessly prosecuting people. But the second reason why it's unlikely to occur is, even though the World Trade Organization has sway, he needs to persuade me and provide arguments as to why the most favored nation rule in the IMF, for instance, is more important than the regional trade blocks that they can already stand by. He needs to prove that the marginal difference between losing the WTO is more significant than the perceptual problems I've identified and the fact that they don't want to be prosecuted. Sure.
Parliamentarians and congressmen approve policy. In all cases, we would prosecute the relevant leaders, the minister for the economy, or the sort of the secretary for the economy, or the prime minister, or the president.
So your policy then is to make sure that every single individual disregards the parliament and just tries to not enact policy even when it's been democratically approved. I think you need to prove to me why it's right for us to violate the democratic rights of individuals, especially when the parliamentarians will then vote the leader out in the vast majority of circumstances in the primary, which means that the individual leader will probably then commit the policy anyways. So, third argument. I think sometimes it's necessary for you to spend a lot of money. Sometimes, for instance, you need to be able to protect things like the environment and subsidize environmental technology companies. Sometimes you need to make sure that some people lose their jobs in the short term so that you can restructure the economy like through austerity. The problem with this policy is that looking at economically disastrous results means that you look at things like employment levels or looking at things like the budget. That means that you can't undergo these long-term projects which are necessary to change the economy over the long run or to protect the environment. I admit that there might be some problems with unemployment in the short run. Why is it that we should care about this variance more? Because he says that we want stability throughout time. The reason why variance is necessary is A, some of these problems are existential. The fact that the environment might collapse means that we should take a hit on the economy because there's an infinite number of people in the future who will be hurt, which means we win the utilitarian outweighing. But the second thing is simply allowing the economy to decline in the long run by not taking these short-term steps means that you get a situation where the infinite number of people financially suffer in the future as well, which wins this argument. Finally, harming the disprivileged. A common problem with imposing strict liability negligence on companies is that they increase the price of their products to ensure that they can pay off all the consequences after the fact. I think this is the exact same case. When you penalize these people by going into their sovereign wealth funds, they're going to increase taxation and reduce spending on government programs like social services to ensure that they never go in the black, or even if they do go in the black, they have offset the cost of that sovereign wealth fund afterwards by paying it out through taxation, which hurts the most disprivileged. Ladies and gentlemen, this policy doesn't work, and even if it did, it hurts people. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
So one of my favorite definitions of developing and developed countries is that developing countries are those in which politics and economics determine how much wealth people have, whereas in developed countries, it's basically just economics. The point of that is to say that in a lot of countries in the world, you have a problem wherein, or like a problem of political economy, wherein like individual leaders make short-term decisions that are bad in many, many cases. But once you commonly agree upon what good decisions are, as defined by a lot of metrics, you don't get those bad decisions anymore. That is, you're able to get stability that's able to let a country develop and get a lot better. So the kinds of variance that they want in their policies, that is, maybe some slightly left-leaning policies and some slightly right-leaning policies, are not the kinds of things that we're talking about. The kinds of disasters that we're talking about are policies that are bad for everyone. That is to say, policies that Tex and I think are easy to identify, easy to prosecute, and remain in the long run. So a couple of things that we brought you. Firstly, we told you this: we get an accountability mechanism that allows you to internalize the cost of your policies when you actually make those decisions. The second thing we told you is that you get a lot less risk and a lot more stability. All of this still accounts for the things that they wish to care about, like flexibility within policies, etc. The point is, we don't get disasters that people kind of know that generally agree are going to be bad, but still pursue for a number of domestic reasons. But first, let's just chat about MEC and take away all their sort of attacks on how this court is going to work and what it's going to do, not going to do. So first, on what actually constitutes a disastrous policy and what doesn't. Their response is twofold. Firstly, is to say it's not clear when a policy is bad and when a policy is good. We outlined when it is clear that a policy is good / when it's bad. So for instance, when a policy takes away money from a lot of people, when you get inflation for in the long run, that really cripples the economy, that takes away jobs, we think that's a bad policy. When you have a policy that's like mildly protectionist, benefits some interest groups and hurts others. So for instance, if you raise the real interest rate by 0.25, that's fine. We're probably not going to prosecute you for that. The point is, it's outcome-based. The second thing they say is, oh, well, it's not clear to identify who the actual stakeholder is who does bad things. We think in every case, like parliamentarians usually approve policies, but there's always someone driving the policy, right? There's always so for instance, if you have a democratic policy enacted when there's a Republican president in power, will probably charge Nancy Pelosi or whoever's in charge of Congress who made things happen, right? The point is, it's usually very easy to identify that stakeholder. But more importantly, we tell you, it doesn't matter who that stakeholder is. We're happy to go hard on saying that this is, that we'll prosecute you if you had power to change something. We think that actually, because we think it's more important that this is outcome-based as opposed to the kinds of stuff that they want to identify. Then they have some problems with enforcement, right? With enforcement, they say, oh, this is going to be biased, etc. So we don't actually think this is the case, right? Because unlike the ICC, you see wherein war crimes happen to take place within a very narrow sphere of the world, you're more likely to see disastrous economic policies around the world, right? That is, you're likely to prosecute a bunch of different people doing a bunch of different things, whether that's right-wing leaders taking away money from their own people, or that's left-wing leaders taking on a lot of debt when in the case that it's disastrous. We think what that means is that you don't see the kinds of problems that they want to identify. So that's like basically how the case differs. Let's chat about what's important in accountability that they don't respond to. So they don't respond to the fact that there are domestic interest groups that are able to dictate policy within every single political party. Their response to this was to say, well, this is exactly why. So their response is like the sort of ANC scenario where that they put up, right? They say, well, every politician is going to sort of make similar decisions because they have domestic interest groups that make those decisions. Yes, that's the problem that you have in the status quo. We changed that because now your stakeholder is not the individual people who vote for the ANC alone. Your stakeholder and the people you need to care about are whether or not those economic policies are good, because you need to care about the personal harms that come to you once you're out of power, and you need to think about whether those policies are good. That is to say, your stakeholder now is the entire economy, because you have to think about whether or not things are good. So what's the problem right now? The problem right now is the short-term problem that tech identifies for you. That is, there's no way of holding people accountable past that term, right? So right now, essentially, the point of elections is you can vote someone out if you don't like the policies they're enacting. The problem is that in 4 years, like Cristina Kirchner de Fernandez in Argentina can take on debt that Argentina has to repay for the next 20 years. So you can't actually solve those problems. But at the point where she now has to front load the cost of being prosecuted 10 years after she's out of power, she doesn't take on that debt in the first place. You can't solve that under the status quo unless you front load these costs and force people to internalize them. We actually do internalize those costs. Happy to take closing.
Yeah, so your policy unfortunately doesn't say exactly you claim. What are the policies that we all agree are bad, and let's not do those? Instead, they say, let's wait until a country crashes and then put in jail their leadership. What country would sign that?
No, I don't think that's actually true. I think economists in many, many cases identify what policies are good and what are bad. Note that there's economic consensus that protectionism, for instance, is bad. We think Trump, for instance, would probably be prosecuted by this court. We think there's like a number of people who would be prosecuted, for instance, like in the 30s for enacting like loose monetary policies. These are quite reasonable in many, many cases. We think, for instance, in developing countries, which is where the bulk of the debate is taking place, the right and the left agree what good policies are. So in 2015, India should probably have like loosened its labor laws, right? Like this is probably a good thing. A lot of Latin American countries should stop taking on a lot of debt, should deregulate and let the economy take over. We think this is often non-ideological and often very easy to agree upon in terms of like what the profession thinks about and what economists agree upon are good policies. No thanks. So insofar as that is true, you change those mechanisms to get identifiable policies that are enacted. But more importantly, let's chat about the risk and how we lessen risk at the point at which we're able to identify what good policies look like. So for two reasons we're particularly able to do this that we heard no response to. So firstly, there's economic consensus in many, many cases, right, on what a good policy is, stuff that I just chatted about. The second thing is you have to, when you're forced to like look at what a court will prosecute and not prosecute, you have to look beyond the ideological criteria of within your own party base, right? So it's not enough to go to this court and say, oh yeah, like we were seizing the means of production, but it's fine that the economy tanked. You have to sort of give a real ideological reason, like with like graphs and numbers and regressions and all those sorts of cool things that economists deal with, right? Which means that you can't actually get away with things, we can't actually get away with the propaganda that you would otherwise use. Why is this really important? So we think right now it's really hard to get assurances, especially in developing countries, that you can invest because you think that the economy might look very, very different and the government's priorities might look very different. So for instance, why would you open up a factory in like a country in Southeast Asia if you know that like their labor laws are going to be strengthened like many years later at the point at which you can't afford that factory anymore? But at the point where you know that the policies are generally good and going to be what they are in the developed world, you tend to invest in the economy in the first place. So the policies that they do want to identify, which they think are heterodox but are not, like China's growth-leading policies, are actually good policies. Like note that China's policy was decentralization, like more market activity. These are things that everyone would support across the world. You get those kinds of policies, and people know that they'll happen. But what's the alternative? We think when Senegal tried to liberalize recently, it didn't see a lot of like investment because like companies didn't believe that it would keep that liberalization, right? Whereas in the case that you think that it's going to keep that liberalization, you get it. Then they chat about basically global warming. Note that that's like a one-point issue. In every other case, like you're like when you do something that's bad, like it hurts the economy as well. We think those like things align, which means that if you do something that's economically good, you tend to do something that's not disastrous for the economy as a whole. So happy to be on Gov.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
As I go through my speech today, I want you to keep in mind the unnerving shift that has happened across Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. At the start, they claim there is no objectively good economic policy. We'll leave the outcomes to say it for themselves. By DPM, they were dictating exactly what each country should do. You should not adopt protectionism. You should always maintain liberalism. Within the end of the day, they aren't supporting any kind of democratic decision whatsoever over economic policy, rather using economists to dictate what exactly these economic policies are. I'm going to show you why, even if that really is their case, it's going to be terrible in 2 questions. 1, what exactly is disastrous economic policy? 2, how do we avoid economic disaster? First, what is disastrous economic policy? Now, they tried to lay out 3 basic criteria for what disastrous economic policy is. I'm going to dispute each of these criteria and demonstrate why it leads to worse outcomes than the ones that you'd avoid. The first criteria of disastrous economic policy, they claim, is that we should determine it based on outcomes rather than based on intentions. I think this is a nice sounding phrase, but there are a bunch of unanswered questions which actually are quite pertinent to this discussion. 2 of these questions, for example. First, what metrics do we use to judge these outcomes? Are we going to use things like budget balance? The reason this is important is because deciding these metrics also creates perverse incentives for politicians to make bad policies simply to cater to these metrics. There was the argument coming up from Jason, where if you were to decide whether or not a country has entered into economic disaster by a budget balance, what they will do is massively increase tax rates in order to maintain a strong budget balance. The second question that is important to ask, and I think more important, is when exactly do we judge economic disaster? This is important. The reason is because if China asked the US to repay all their debt tomorrow, they would be in economic disaster. But it's hardly true that the current administration is in charge of most of the debt accumulation. In fact, we cannot pinpoint any singular administration who had this a big role to play in this debt accumulation anyway, because it was a process that happened over time. Listen to their language. If they believe in economic continuity, it is all therefore then they would say these same individuals who sustain the continuity of that accumulation should be punished. For these reasons, we think they don't precisely recognize who exactly is responsible. We think it's arbitrary. We think it's unfair. The claim coming out from Deputy is that there is some degree of economic consensus. Yes, but there was also economic consensus that government should invest heavily in the housing market because it was always going to rise before the crash. I'm unclear why economists saying that something is correct means that politicians should not be punished or should be held accountable if they turned out to have listened to economists and the economists turn out to be wrong. You don't give us any indication why these politicians are responsible, even if they adopted the practices that economists said were generally good. For these reasons, already on that premise alone, we think you're out of the debate. Second claim of what a disastrous economic policy is coming out from opening government. There is concentrated benefit, but we wouldn't consider it disastrous if there's concentrated harm. The conclusion of their claim is we incentivize redistribution because harms are concentrated in the wealthy. Let me propose an alternative possibility which is far more politically palatable. You concentrate the harms in the poor. You increase tax rates for the lower income, which, by the way, by the deputy, when they said if it's going to be hyperinflationary, we think that's disastrous. Concentrating harms in the poor is the least likely to be inflationary, whereas concentrating harms in those who are economically powerful is likely to drive up wages and therefore drive up prices as well. For their own metrics of what causes economic disaster, those perverse incentives force these governments to increase tax for the poor or for the lower income. We think that's terrible because concentrate benefits in those who are most economically vulnerable. Once again, no response from the deputy. No, thank you. Third, they claim it is economically disastrous if you forego continuity. And the reason for this claim is that it's really good to have stable growth. That is trivially true. We admit it's really good to have stable growth, and if there was an easy way to do it without incurring economic harm, no government would not do it. The question is obviously that there are some economic trade-offs to be made every time continuity happens. Continuity being in action doesn't mean that you aren't making an active economic decision. When you continue a policy, you also continue the harms that come along with it. The exact policies that were continued in the past were the same policies of debt accumulation that you now stand against. I'm unclear why you stand for economic continuity if it means radical changes can often reform the economy significantly. Here's the way. They don't provide us a clear definition of what disastrous economic policy is. There are 2 outcomes to this. Either, 1, the outcome of the judgment is going to be unfair. We think that's just intrinsically bad to any court to penalize people unfairly. Maybe we don't like people who are rich, but it doesn't mean we can take away their money and our whims and fancies unfair. Or it leads to worse economic outcomes, outweighing all the benefits coming out from deputy as well, because they concentrate benefits in economically vulnerable. Even if you get good policy in the short term, we think these harms far outweigh that because the poor just cannot access any of the benefits that you claim. Or both, it's unfair, and it leads to worse outcomes. We think it's generally terrible. We don't think you provide a clear metric of what disastrous economic policy is. Before I move on to the second question, go.
No set of statutes in the world is as black and white or as easy to apply as you seem to think the gov bench has to defend. That does not mean it is a bad idea to have laws in place against some terrible things, so when they do occur, we can deter those things or punish the people who are held accountable.
Well, I think there are. First, I don't think it give us any any idea of what these policies are going to be in real life. Massive deregulation was something that there was economic consensus about. Many people thought deregulating Wall Street is a good thing, but no one in the world thinks massive genocide is bad. I think there's quite a clear statute that we have on our side, which you don't provide on your side. So maybe give us a few of these statutes, at least in closing, to let us believe in your model. You don't give us any real idea of how this is going to take place. Second question, how do you avoid economic disaster? Important thing to make clear here, there are existing incentives for people not to do really shitty things. One, if an economy falls into shambles, politicians are also hurt as well. Generally not good for them. Two, if you stand for re-election, you don't want to have a bad economic track record. Three, your party will stop you from doing really shitty things as a minister. Four, there are future prospects of entering into the financial market. If you're known as the guy who crashed Wall Street, we don't think that's going to lead you to a fancy job in future. There are huge existing incentives already to stop people making bad economic decisions. They don't do it for a variety of reasons, not least because they often don't predict the bad outcomes that occur. But the claim coming out from government is even worse. They claim, we should pin this on a particular group of leaders. I think there are two possible scenarios under this. One actually less likely than the other. The first is that a small group decide. No, this is actually the dynamic in very few countries across the world. Even if this is true, all the questions that I levied previously about why this group in particular, rather than every other group who contributed to developing the economic foundations of a country, and who might have tacitly consented, therefore, by continuing previous economic policy to eventual economic disaster because they don't build a strong foundation, because they didn't have high reserves in the past, why this particular group is the one held predominantly responsible for bad economic outcomes. We don't hear any response of their side. You're just punishing the wrong people. But the second and more likely scenario is when Parliament decides. Now, the problem with this is that you create a perverse incentive then for ministers to act undemocratically, insofar as they recognize that their personal wealth is the one on the line, and no one in Parliament really cares. So if they know that a Parliament is having an economic decision which they personally believe to be bad, then they would essentially not act in line with Parliament. We think that's terrible because that's undemocratic, no warrant on their side as to why this is a good thing. The only thing we hear from deputies is, we don't care if we get the right person. Yes, I guess we all don't like people who are rich, but it doesn't mean we can just randomly take away their money. We think there's just some grounds we think just courts should have, and one of them is to probably get fair prosecution. If you're not responsible, you should not be held responsible. So, contrast the weighing then. On our side, we have existing incentives that disincentivize disastrous economic policy. On their side, either is unfair or undemocratic, or both. For all these reasons, we provide better economic outcomes. We're fairer opposed.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the member of government.
There are two contentions from opening opposition in this debate. Firstly, that you cannot actually target the exact people who perpetrated those crimes, and secondly, because it is not clear what economic policy is disastrous. We think that their whole case is dependent on these two issues, and we think to the extent in which we can identify the exact countries in which people are actually the ones in power and who are perpetrating these stupid economic policies that everyone in the world can say, yes, they are stupid, their whole case falls down. What are these countries? These are the exact countries like Venezuela, like Russia, that have huge political spending, that are absolutely in charge of all the political decisions made in that specific countries, and that have huge control over the media, that are the ones that are individually and directly responsible, and that make economic policies that everyone can understand with using simple indicators that have been already provided by opening government to be true. To that extent, when we can identify and apply this model of opening government to these countries, we see exactly the fact that those are the exact policies and the direct responsibility that we have. We're going to have three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the principal justification and why we should, as an international court, have a right to actually prosecute those crimes. Secondly, I'm going to explain and characterize what these countries actually look like. And thirdly, I'm going to explain how this changes the incentives of those individual. Closing, you had a question.
Yeah, given that everyone knows what are the countries that will be prosecuted and indicted under this motion, and your OG offered to make this an opt-in method, how many countries will ever end up being prosecuted by this process?
Opening government has told you that there are going to be international institutions involved and are going to be in the long run doing that. So that means that these countries in the long run will make the kinds of policies that I will talk about in my case. So we think that yes, it's going to be opt-in, but that means in the long run there aren't going to be countries like those you have in Iran or in Russia. So firstly, so before that, one point of refutation. Opening opposition asserts that you have to have radical steps in order to make a concrete change. Yes, you have have to make radical steps, but those radical steps aren't necessarily something that are economically disastrous. Yes, you are going to be risk-free, and that means that like policies like that Deng did, for example, are going to be economically beneficial, but things like Great Leap of Mao probably aren't and are probably economically disastrous, and everyone can tell that they are. Firstly, the justification. So we think that in the vast majority of countries, in transition economies, we think that like sovereignty and the ability to choose for yourself is only instrumental right insofar as it allows people to choose for themselves what is good for them. This does not happen in these precise countries for a few reasons. Firstly, the economic policies is likely to be bad because of absence of these institutions such as central bank, where you can't have a good monetary policy, and you have things like hyperinflation in Zimbabwe that hurts a large number of people. Secondly, you don't have other institutions that are providing check on the government policies in those countries. Thirdly, you have a mischaracterization in the media of what these policies actually do to people, so that those people are unable and don't have information to actually assess to which degree that policy affects them. And there is also a huge amount of fear-mongering of specific minorities, even if those economic policies fail, to blame those people. For example, the tendency of Russian leaders to blame the West for all the economic problems. So insofar as that's true, you don't get the instrumental value of that sovereignty for those people, because they're unable, we're saying that the international community, because they're unable to prosecute them themselves, and secondly, because the only international institution that is able to do that has the right to inflict that. The same thing we have with war crimes. So what these countries actually do in the status quo, they have two choices. Firstly, they either pursue good economic policies or they use the economy to achieve short-term political decisions. These are things like prop up security for short term. These are things like benefit certain number of people. No, thank you. So what that means is, so the cost-benefit analysis usually falls onto providing those short-term goals. For example, when you have huge amount of oil, you use that oil not to bring benefit to your people, but precisely, for example, to prop up your security and to prop up your control of media. What that means in the long run is it means that firstly, the people who are most hurt are minorities who are not liked in the popular media narrative in those countries. Secondly, you have long-term bad economic effect, and thirdly, you have less freedoms to do that. How do we change that with our policy? So there are incentives will be incentives in the status future to actually do that. So open government talked about cooperation of international organizations, for example. At the point in which you will lose access to WTO, World Bank, and IMF finances, we say that you as a country, you as a leader of your country, are unlikely to pursue that policy because if in the status quo the economic benefits and providing for people might not be that concrete as concretely, for example, having more security personnel that will guarantee your power. At the point in which you know that you will lose access to WTO, you will lose access to unemployment, that means that you don't want to do that. An opening opposition said, look, they have regional blocks. At the point in which you have, for example, ASEAN and Myanmar is the one violating, we can say that the whole other countries can be excluded from the ability to cooperate in WTO, so they still will lose access to those regional blocks also. At the point in which you know that the sanctions will be applied and they're also going to be personal sanctions, as opening government said, and that you can't travel, you realize the concrete losses that you have on you. And even the international standing that for those personalities that we're talking about are very important, because Putin likes to attend would like to attend G7 meeting. He is unlikely to actually pursue that policy. So yes, on the so what that actually means and what that actually looks like is that those countries and those people don't pursue that policy in the first place. But why is that something that is going to be likely, and they're not going to, the majority of people are not just going to say, well, look, this is the West that is doing that. Because even if in countries like Iran you blame the West, it doesn't mean that you, for example, the reason why Iran went on a nuclear deal is because they realized the concrete economic losses that they have, and for those people it is far more important, because they realize that they are losing their job, they are losing something that is more important to them than the propaganda that Iran wages on you. So at that point, when you know that you will lose popular support and the the disastrous long-term economic policies will be disastrous for you, not just in the long term, but also in the short term. That changes the cost-benefit analysis. And even if that means that authoritarian leaders are likely in the long run to be like more and more powerful, that still is far better for those people because they can get the economic benefits for their lives. That means they have better jobs, that means they have better lives, and they're able to access their future. This is what these countries are what this debate is about. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the member of the opposition.
So the only thing that's easy and obvious in this debate is that it's still fundamentally unclear what exactly counts as a disastrous economic policy. Because we've heard, for example, from the extreme end, things like the Great Leap Forward and things like Robert Mugabe, the sorts of things we prosecute in the ICC criminal court for crime against humanity anyway. But then we've also heard seeded through the opening government's examples, for example, it might be a disastrous economic policy to give exploited Asian workers labour rights because then the factories might leave. So you might be prosecuted for actually extending labour rights to people. We then saw an extension kind of example that it becomes a disastrous economic policy to accuse him to spend money on his own security detail and to control the media. Something else which is not immediately obviously linked to an economy either. So we are so unclear as to how this will be applied. Why is that incredibly important? Well, firstly, we think that makes it incredibly hard for anybody in the world to be clear when prospectively they're deciding what their policies are going to be. Because you're judging them on the consequences by some metric which you seem to reveal later on, whereas people can never justly act if they're doing that. But secondly, and the other reason why it's incredibly important, is because we think that the very policies they do undermine the democratic rights of the mandated people, and that's the core extension that we're going to bring on this side of the House. After that, I'm also going to talk about the economic effect, why this trend is towards following a false and wrong orthodoxy, and thirdly, about why it's generally inappropriate, unfair, and ineffective. So in terms of democratic mandate, so we heard this from our opposition to say that this trend will over people's rights. But what's the analysis that really supports that? Well, firstly, economic policy is a sovereign democratic right which should not be trampled for three reasons. Firstly, we think it's of incredible national importance to those people. Secondly, and crucially, it involves trade-offs between different goals. So groups of people come together to decide what they're going to prioritise, whether it's going to be like more labour rights at the cost of lower growth, which is something that the OG said that people might not be able to do anymore, or whether it's going to be focusing on increasing inequality in order to chase more growth. And thirdly, there's reasonable disagreement about what the effects of these policies are and what people should do. This necessarily removes that. Why? Well, firstly, bear in mind that if people in that country agree that their leader has screwed it up, there are existing political ways to remove them. Vote them out of power, remove them from influential positions, and those sorts of things. You can even, if you want to, prosecute them internally for that kind of stuff. There's no reason necessarily to have an international court to do this, so it could be dealt with nationally. But secondly, we think, once you say, but secondly, we think that often these people don't actually necessarily agree with you and agree with the IMF and the World Bank as to what the actual policies are, because they've assumed that it's clear to everybody, including the citizens of their own countries. But the fact is, people in Venezuela voted in and voted for those policies and voted for things that they thought would advance them. So we think often there'll be a disagreement between what the national political structure, what people believe on the ground in the country itself, and what the international court itself believes. So we think that in order for this to be an operation, the court is going to have to declare, for example, that Venezuela itself has committed a disastrous economic policy, something that its own citizens don't believe because they voted for that policy and believe in that leader. So at that point, the court effectively has to impose itself on that nation so it becomes an adversarial process. So the very operation of your court either could be dealt with nationally if all the citizens agree, or necessarily means that you have to prosecute the leader against the will of the citizens for putting in things that those citizens have voted for. We think that makes it really clear that what the intention of this to do is to ride roughshod over the democratic will and accountability of those people. We think that's something that they can't ever stand for, particularly in an area where it's so unclear what it is that actually counts as disastrous economic policy. But and then we heard from the closing government that actually they also potentially, and it wasn't that clear to me, sorry, from the closing government, want to punish the country by giving the country lower access to the IMF loans or lower access to the World Bank. So they want to punish and sanction the country for pursuing policies that the people they want to pursue only because some international kind of court or set of Western experts thinks that people should be rationally preferring other things. So we think it absolutely undermines democratic will. It's some good reason to reject this. But even if if people were behind this, we think it undermines efforts to actually to pursue good policies. Why? So let's assume the state cooperates, sends this person off to the court, and they get prosecuted. In terms of how the people then perceive the effects of that policy, that blames the individual leader as a scapegoat for pursuing those policies. That necessarily prevents the proper focus of democratic decision-making and debate in that country around what is the, what is the policies that have caused this, what is the party, and that sort of stuff. So effectively, it means that they don't root out the party or don't adequately deal with the problem, but instead scapegoat the leader. So if there's anything that we've learned, it's so fundamentally unclear on multiple levels what exactly counts as this, that there are going to be numerous examples of this court trying to prosecute leaders for doing things that the people believed were in their own interests. For example, in Thailand, and for example, also in Venezuela, giving large cash handouts to people in rural areas to try and elevate their positions that way. So we think that yes, go.
Lots of economists have lots of papers about why cash handouts might be good. We won't prosecute them because they're defensible. But every single economist agrees taking away investors' assets is a bad idea. In the cases where it's ambiguous whether a policy is good or bad, we won't prosecute. We won't prosecute the clear cases.
So it's going to be ambiguous in almost every case, right? So because there's a lot of people a lot of left-wing economists defended the approach in Venezuela, and a lot of them blamed the failure of that approach not on the policies themselves, but on the actions of other states that they took. For example, the United States sanctioning Venezuela, or the structure of the global economy that hurts developing nations. I'll get onto that in a sec, but we think that if your case is that in every ambiguous possible case we're not going to prosecute, then we'd be very few prosecutions, except maybe nationalization. But then again, you might, as a democratic people, willfully prefer to nationalize things like farms in Zimbabwe at the cost of the economic harms. We think people should be able to make that decision. If they want to trade off having sovereignty and taking control over those assets over the economic growth, they should be allowed to take that into account. So in terms of the economic effect, well, we think this encourages people to pursue economic orthodoxy. So if the state is going to be deterred and is going to comply with this, at that point they say, well, let's just pursue what the World Bank says we should do and all those kind of things. Often that's actually not the right recipe for that country. Often that does involve like a lot of economic pain and those sorts of things. We think it's hard, also hard to structurally adjust as the opening covered. So we think ultimately the economic effects of this are going to be quite bad. And if your example of continuity is that you shouldn't have labour restrictions added on later on in a currently low wage level economy, we think those are exactly the kind of things that, if your thing works, are going to keep those countries poor forever, because they can't do what developing countries have done and start to impose labour regulations, start to impose mandatory sick leave and all the kinds of things that make those people happier and better off. So your version of continuity effectively is then to fix the global economy as it is with rich countries and poor countries there. At the end of the day, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the government whip.
I believe that the definition in this way is pretty clear. Provide universally intuitive policies that create certain disastrous economic inefficiencies, and we are going to prosecute those. For instance, spending a huge amount of money into the military, which also creates these kind of inefficiencies. But in the status quo, governments of those countries actually have a capability to track on that and identify which policy is actually a highly risk-averse policy. But my partner explained why and how the incentive structures of these politicians work, and we believe we are going to change that. I'll have two things in this speech. Firstly, our principle justify why principle just to prosecute those politicians, and second of all, I'll explain the practical outcomes and how changing the incentives actually means you have far greater economy in those developing countries. So firstly, beginning is very simple. We say that we should prevent people from feeling the consequences of those policies they did not use their consent to. We say that the developing countries are the most unique and vulnerable relevant actors in this debate. Why? Because the systems of checks and balances work very effectively in the West. It means that institutions in the West, in the Western countries, are actually separate, like judiciary, which means that developing countries don't have access to these kind of things, but also people are relatively educated and can have a free discussion on the policies, and free media actually, which allows them this kind of platform does not exist only in developing countries. And the problem we identified is that in developing countries there is a vice versa situation. The Bosnian opposition told you that there is a right of people to determine the voices they want. But in a state of unity that people should access the genuine choice. I'll show points out at least three important things, how actually the choice is constructed. Firstly, he told you that the genuine choice should have an information, and the people, second of all, should have an access to that information and the possible drawbacks of the policy. But third of all, people should have certain kind of alternative policies that, and at least the media that's objective and that provides this kind of platform for people to discuss how actually this policy is moving back. But in many circumstances, disastrous economic policies doesn't meet that criteria. And consequences, unfortunately, are disproportionately felt by the most poor part of the population. The electorate that governments can ignore for less bargaining power and for less benefit for the parties. Open opposition told you that we can't instrumentalize people and it's unfair. First logic they provided is that they didn't know the consequences. But actually they are more likely to know the consequences than not knowing, because first of all they have access to the full information regarding the whole state, but second of all they can predict through consulting to economists about the future of the policy. The second logic they provided is that parties define the economic policy, but not really. Actually, that kind of logic especially doesn't hold in developing countries, because strong leadership and whole control of the party like in China or like in Central Asian countries, that does actually prove that logic is counterintuitive, but it also leaders in those countries have a sole control of which laws can and which laws cannot pass, like Turkey. So we believe that that's principally obligatory to allow the people to have a genuine choice, and if they don't, then at least prosecute and not provide that choice either. But secondly, talking about the practical outcomes, we see that every team of this debate wants the development of the economy to developing countries. Whether countries, on the issue of whether countries will sign, open government told you that they will sign because there are certain benefits like trading. But more importantly, we said that it changed the rational cost-benefit analysis. Even if the leaders will still spend on military, etc., they realized that after, for instance, huge sanctions, there will be low budget in general to spend on things like military, that they're highly prioritized, but also there are far higher levels of dissatisfaction of people, which means that we have far more chance of protests and the delegitimization of the power and the media. Politicians realize that, and we believe that works. Open opposition told you that radical policies sometimes transform the economy. My partner already answered that radical policies, if they can work, they won't be such a huge risk-averse policies. But even if that's not the case, the fact that radical policy works for certain countries does not mean that it will work for the many. Yeah, there are actually huge risks associated with that, and risks are crucially an irreparable harm. It means that there are anti-done opportunities such as good contracts with companies are gone and will not come back to the state. So,
Your mechanism for why these countries will join this court is because they care about the economy and want the benefits of the WTO. But they're already negligent economically already and don't care, like Russia and Venezuela. Why will this create that additional incentive and weigh out against the risk of personal prosecution?
Yeah, further I'll do is how we change, I'll include that how we change that. So my partner told you that current incentives are focused on the short term, and those incentives are structured in that way because first of all, there are no checks and balances in those countries, but second of all, there are no future costs associated with the policy. They know that it can go without that. So how we change that, and that's also the big extension from my partner. We said that there would be anti-non benefits, and my partner told you that Putin would still want to attend the G7 and etc. And note that that's not only because of economic reasons, but also it's also about enhancing the cult of personality. For instance, the fact that Putin attended G7 means that the media and people actually discuss that, oh, our leader is highly authoritative, which means that there are some good personal political incentive for politicians to engage in this kind of behavior. And those in opposition told you that we can prosecute through national courts and etc. They already admitted that there are no checks and balances, things like good judiciary to do these kind of things in developing states, but also most states cannot do themselves because the whole power is concentrated on parties. So what does it mean? It means that yes, even in the status quo, we cannot prosecute Putin, but in the status future, the one who will prosecute Putin will be pressured and highly pressured because he realizes the costs, both personal costs and costs for his authority and future political is at high risk. And that's important because there are no, we believe that this is important because there are no other means to do these kind of things, like the alternative coming from those oppositions having work, but also developing countries that should develop properly, otherwise there will be huge harm inflicted on the poor people and on the minorities that my partner already talked about. So we believe that on principle and practical that we should call for quasi-government defense.
Thank you for that speech. For the last debate, let's go to opposition whip.
I'm going to talk to you about two things. One, why this policy will literally never be enforced. And secondly, about what remains of this debate if it's never enforced, which happens to be quite serious effects on effective political process. Let's dive in. The definition we get from open government is that this is an opt-in case in which only the most extreme cases will be judged with no redeeming justification. And I quote, things that have no defense of why people have done. Now, only government claim that countries will opt in because it will be shamed to opt in, right? So embarrassing to say, what, am I planning to do any terrible economic policies? We think that's not how people will see it. Several reasons for that have already been given. One, the ICC itself doesn't have a great record, and even the United States haven't joined the ICC, and they go to wars just to protect human rights. So we don't see how this specific policy would. Secondly, as opposed to crime against your people, where it really is embarrassing to say, I don't want to be judged if I commit crimes against my people and crimes against humanity, just saying you disagree with the economic policies of the powers that control this institution, we think is a much easier measure. Third, no thank you. Even if some join, know that those who will join will be those that agree with economic policies. We keep hearing from government side, there are policies that everyone agrees are good, right? Those people that agree are good will not be the ones enacting the policies that they are afraid of, right? The problem is that the people joining will end up being the Western, economically liberal economies that are not trying to prosecute. Only those who think that nationalizing the means of production are a good economic policy will be the ones you want to actually prosecute. They then say, look, but many countries kind of agree on what their policy, they agree with themselves, they agree with us, A, so they won't enact these policies, and B, if you have tons of countries agreeing that certain policies are bad, just have an agreement not to do those policies, rather than an agreement that says, we will not define which policies they are, we'll just prosecute you afterwards, and also send you to jail after you have crashed your country. We also hear this wonderful case about how, Putin will want to go to the G7, and so he will do this. Again, if we're talking about extreme policies, then why would Putin do something that has no defense, no redeeming justification, and would crash the Russian economy, but he also wants to go to meetings abroad. So that means we just don't buy any of this analysis. Unless we note that even though governments, and especially I think the tech did a wonderful job of nuances and why they look at this, know that these nuances are lost on the population, right? The UK left the EU because of a lying bus. We don't think that it would be hard, no thank you, for governments, especially governments that disagree with the West, to say, look, they're just trying to impose their economic ideas on us. We don't want that, and therefore not sign and not risk themselves with any personal prosecution. We think this will fail. Note that even if they do sign, you don't end up convicting. The ICC itself takes years, and we're prosecuting people who told thousands and thousands of soldiers to murder an ethnicity, and even that takes about 7 years to get to actual proof. Here, we're talking about an economic policy that should have no redeeming qualities, unless, of course, we're talking about the bizarre examples that they gave, which we think have tons of redeeming qualities, like giving employees rights, or like Putin's security detail. Note that once we take this down this takes down a lot in this debate. Note that all the incentives to politicians drop, so different financial policies drop. Next, fall down the macro effect that would happen out of these great policies. And thirdly, the fact that all of the analysis we did for CG, that they have a right to do this, they won't end up doing this, so we don't really care. Note that opening opposition, we give POIs and opening opposition as well. Right from the start, they mentioned that this won't actually be opted in. They just then continue to spend the majority of the time on what happens if this does actually become a reality. So wait, is this the first ever four-way tie in debate? No one said anything. There are no advantages. No, because there are a lot of damages that incur when you just start and claim that these people should be prosecuted. Specifically regarding effective political pressures and a lot of what we heard from Paul. So let's talk about effective political processes. So opening opposition start off with kind of this principled democratic right, adds on that by saying kind of the reason we want people, it's not just an abstract right, the reason is because we have to make trade-offs, and all of these policies always have trade-offs. Specifically, we were talking about economic growth versus inequality. Note specifically that the US, for example, which is presumably a leading partner in this kind of international institution, is quite crazy when it comes to how much you are willing to give up equality for economics. So we don't agree that these cases are obvious, even when this institution thinks they are. No, thank you. But most importantly, note, even if you never send anyone to jail, the fact that you have this institution and the fact that you call for jailing the individual really, really plays into the hands of terrible, terrible governments. Why? Because democracies, and not even democracies, even non-democracies, the control of the people depends on the fact that the people can hold the government accountable. And this policy makes it harder in two ways. One, it really enforces the narrative that is the individual's fault rather than the ideology, the institution, or the government itself. Note that China has no problem blaming Mao for perhaps, they wouldn't say wrong, but perhaps wrong policies. And it's okay, because now we have a completely different leader, and he will lead us to greatness. Instead of focusing on the fact that having too much power at the hands of one individual might be incredibly dangerous. Why does this play into that? Because we now have a court that's saying, look, this person should be in jail. It is incredibly easy, both for democratic parties and for undemocratic governments, to now say, look, the problem is not the institution. The international community, even the West that is always picking on us, even they think that that individual is to blame. This makes it incredibly easy for these governments to continue their atrocities without actually paying the price. It's very easy for the party to then throw away in jail the one individual that happened to be in the lead at that point in time and then continue. Yes, okay.
Surely then the next set of individuals chosen to continue to perpetuate these policies would quickly realize they would be left with the bill and as a result stop doing these policies which are bad.
They just won't opt in, so you don't need to, but you still have America and the EU calling out that China needs to be inside, or that Uganda needs to be inside, and that person needs to be prosecuted. They literally will not opt in and don't need to opt in for the damage to the economy. And lastly, it also puts sovereignty on the side of bad leaders. They set it up as cases in which they were clearly wrong. Everyone knows it was a terrible economic policy. If that's the case, it is incredibly easy for the countries to deal with them themselves, politically, or even jail them if they did something illegal genuinely. But what they're doing is now making this a complex debate, because now you're either on the side of our leader or on the side of the West that wants to intervene. We hear from both governments the statement that, look, Russians don't know about the policies because the government is always blaming all the consequences on the West. The solution? Let's try and legislate more of what these countries do. We're creating a caricature that makes it even easier to hide these policies and these consequences from individuals. We're making it easier for governments and for bad governments to defend themselves against these policies, even when we're calling out and actually doing nothing. Don't play into the hands of dictatorships and bad governments. Give us a normal policy. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that round. I'm going to give you the results, how we came to those results. If you have any other questions, you can find either one of us after. We came to a unanimous decision, first going to opening opposition, second to closing opposition, third to opening government, and fourth, unfortunately, to closing government. So I'm going to walk you through chronologically what we think main contributions were and how they related to each other. So starting in opening government, I think both, it's strange to start with opposition in explaining government's contribution, but I think there's a large extent to which both opposition teams are right, that there needs to be a leg to stand on under government for there to be a lot of the impacts that I think most of your case revolves around. So there needs to be a reason for us to believe that there is an example, a situation, not even generalizable, but like a chance that there would be an enforcement of punishment for leaders that have clearly done something detrimental to their economy. And I think it became increasingly hard to see where that happened, which also means that a lot of the impacts that you tie to it in terms of those people, like it being legitimate to punish those people, but more pervasively, the stuff about deterrence, the stuff about restructuring, the stuff about how you redress for people's suffering as a result of bad decisions in the economy become quite hard to weigh. So I think that's the most important. I think that's the reason why you lose to both of the opposition teams. I'll be more specific as to what the things were they said to attack that. I think the other thing to note is it was also hard to see what remained without any of the enforcement. So even if there is a degree to which we believe a principal justification of punishment, it still relies on a degree to which there is guilt and to which you can point towards who is guilty, and we found it hard to see where that became true. So let's bring in opening opposition. I think you spent the overwhelming majority of your time in both of the speeches explaining why it's just wildly unclear when disastrous policy is disastrous, when you would determine it to be disastrous, who the people are that you would hold responsible, meaning that, first of all, you take down all of the strong stuff, I think, all of the strong impacts from opening government in terms of deterrence and enforcement and punishment and legitimacy, etc. But you also, I think, do something quite clever when you talk about the opt-in and when you think you can reasonably expect countries to opt in. What you do there is, I think you take the strongest part of their characterization to say that in the most extreme cases where it would be blatantly obvious that you've made economically disastrous mistakes, you say it is in those cases also proportionally unlikely that those countries would opt in, meaning that even the strongest cases where their claim is that it's obvious that you've made mistakes and you would obviously be punished, become less likely to be punished. And lastly, I think you do have a comparative, not just to say that no one would be punished and there are no benefits on prop, but also to say that there are other accountability mechanisms that you probably already take into account to a large extent and why those are more accurate and result in better, like taking into account more important or determinant factors in your economy and why you think those are more relevant. So then, let's bring in closing government. So I think what you do is you fall into the trap that opening opposition sets up for you, which is you try to aggressively frame out the unclarity and say, but it's actually about the most obvious examples. It's about the times where leadership is unwilling to listen to any democratic mandate, where they censor media to the point where no one can make any informed decision. It's about those cases where there is global and like unanimous consensus that they've made economic mistakes. In those cases, it also becomes, therefore, even more unlikely that they would opt in, and that's something you're questioned on and not something you managed to be able to fix. And other than that, a lot of the stuff that you explain sounds either very similar to opening government or relies on us believing that there are characterizations or examples or circumstances in which you would be able to enforce. So you fall into the same problem as opening government, but I think some of your examples are even more extreme, meaning that you can't, I don't think you can claim even the degree of clarity that we did believe from opening government under your side, unfortunately. And then I think a lot of the responses to opening opposition and to a degree closing opposition are basically, please believe us, there is a characterization that we can stand over, revolving into, I think, or devolving into the same problem we talked about before. So then, lastly, to bring in closing opposition, we talked quite a while about what we think you contributed and how you managed to place that or use that against other teams. I think eventually we agreed on 2 or 3 things that we think you added. The first one is, for some reason, it was somewhat unclear from top half why it mattered that there was not just a lot of unclarity about what economically disastrous policy is, but why there was no clarity whatsoever. So not just in the majority of cases you would prosecute unfairly or wouldn't prosecute when you should have prosecuted, it's that it is impossible to calculate when you are making economically detrimental choices as a leader. So you would never take it into account as a deterrent. And also B, why that was probably determinant of the outcome of the debate. So you just point out that a lot of the stuff that OO does, you add an extra reason for us to believe that people wouldn't be able to take this punishment into account in their calculus of what policy they push as a politician. And then you give that impact that stands, I think, slightly separately from opening opposition. The second thing you do is, it's like a few claims about politicians and how they would respond to the existence of one of these bodies, even if they never prosecute. So I'm not sure we were convinced that that argument would also stand if they would never, ever, ever prosecute, because it seems like, and I think that was pointed out somewhat, where it seems void to be like, there's an international body that has never done anything, but they're out for us, and they're attacking our sovereignty and our ability to make financial decisions. But we did definitely believe that it was also a different way in which politicians would respond. You say it probably means that they would, to a way larger extent, that A, people would respond by saying, it's leadership that's to blame, not structure of the economy, and B, that you would just not have economic discussions and policy whatsoever. We also think OO did something in this argument, so we're unsure whether it's completely new, but what it definitely does is your case as a whole, A, shows again why, in a different way, the setup for government is a problem. Not only that means that there is no impact whatsoever in this round, but that probably puts an opposition team over them, but also B, gives us enough reason to believe that there is a harm that stands independent of opening opposition. I don't think you ever attempt to weigh it against them. So, and like at large, it's also an argument that they try to run even if it's slightly different. So you don't manage to take it over them, but you definitely give us enough reason for you to fly based on rebuttal and a little extension. All right, so that's it in terms of results. If you have any questions, come and find us. Good luck next round.